Awesome. Well, we are so happy to have Syd Cannings here today, giving us his talk about the bumblebees of British Columbia, big Bumbly and Beleaguered. So Syd was born and raised in the Okanagan Valley in a family of naturalists. And he began to study the natural world seriously at UBC, where he received his bachelor's and master's degree in zoology. After graduation, he became the curator of the insect collection at UBC from 1980 to 1991 and began a series of summer insect surveys to the Yukon. In 1991, Syd moved to Victoria to become the zoologist for the BC Conservation Data Centre, and for the next decade, he traveled the province, searching out its hotspots of diversity and rarity. In 2003, the call of the Yukon pulled him north again, and he has worked as a species at-risk biologist for the Canadian Wildlife Service in Whitehorse ever since. In the last decade, Syd has become interested in bumblebees and has led the development of federal conservation plans for the yellow-banded bumblebee and the Gypsy Cuckoo bumblebee, and was involved in the discovery of a previously unknown species, the Kluane bumblebee. Working with his brother Richard, he has written a number of books on the natural history of British Columbia, including British Columbia, A Natural History, The New BC Roadside Naturalist, Geology of British Columbia, and The World of Freshwater. British Columbia Natural History won several awards, including the Bill Duthie Bookseller's Choice Award for the best book published in BC, the Canadian Science Writers Book Award, and the Lieutenant Governor's Silver Medal for the best book on the history of Columbia. And if you don't have these books, you need to get them because they are amazing. They're just such a treasure. We're so lucky to have such amazing resources about this beautiful province that we live in. So thank you so much, Syd, for speaking tonight and being here with us. And I'll take it over to you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I'm going to share my screen now, but oh dear. Whoops. That didn't go right. Just a minute. There we are. Well, good evening, everyone. Hello, all my old friends and even some relatives on the screen there. I wish I were there in person, of course, to say hi to everyone and give you a big hug, but that's not going to happen tonight. But it does, as you say, this Zoom thing does give you the opportunity to talk to everyone around the world, and that's fabulous. So hello to everyone again, and I guess we'll just get right into it. And if you have questions, as Stephanie said, and thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction too. That was very nice. And as Stephanie said, I think we'll have the questions on the. You can put the questions up on chat, or even unmute yourself at the end, or something like that to ask the questions. And I'd be happy to stick around and chat. So tonight, I'm going to tell you a bit about bumblebees. And as Stephanie said, it was about 10 years ago, I was always interested in insects, and I was curator of insect collections and things like that, but I never really, to be honest, paid much attention to bumblebees themselves. I always kind of assumed we knew a lot about them, or they were already well known, and so I never even really collected any or whatever, and didn't make an attempt to kind of really even learn them, to be honest, until about 10 years ago, when they started showing up on our endangered species lists and into my work area. And then I thought, oh, I could really get into this. And so over the last 10 years, I've really started looking at them, paying attention, learning them, and found that it's just a fascinating story. And as usual, when you start learning about something, you realize how little you know and how little we, as humans, know about bumblebees in general, how little we know about the bumblebees of British Columbia or Canada, and so on. But there's a lot to say, despite all that, there's a lot to say. And so I better get going on this. So here we are. I'm going to just start just to give you a brief outline as to what we're going to cover tonight. I'm going to talk about bees in general for just a couple of seconds. What are bees? What are bumblebees? What kind of bees are they? And just a couple of minutes on basic bumblebee biology. There's a lot of bees here, isn't there? And then spend just a few minutes on just to introduce you to some of the common bees, bumblebees of Vancouver Island around the area that some of you at least live. And then get to where I intersect with this is the bumblebees at risk, the endangered, threatened, ones of conservation concern, and why that might be. And then at the end, talking about monitoring bumblebees, how we find out how they're doing, and how you as citizens out there can help count bumblebees and help conserve them as well. So that covers the bases there. So what are bees? Here's a big Nevada bumblebee, by the way, from the Yukon. Bees are basically vegetarian wasps, vegan wasps. And they diverge, they're just regular wasps. They're very closely related. They're in the middle of a big wasp family called the digger wasps. And about 130 million years ago, flowering plants began to flourish, and these particular wasps figured out that you could eat pollen and nectar and also feed your babies, more importantly, feed your babies pollen, and you wouldn't have to catch and provision your nests with caterpillars or spiders or whatever else they were eating. So they began to collect pollen and feed their young pollen. And today there's over 430 species of bees in British Columbia, and they look like bumblebees here. They also look like these little parasitic nomad bees, these leafcutter bees, these andrenids, and so on. There's 430 more species, most of which, like these small pictures I've just showed you, are all solitary bees. The mother bees dig their own little burrows in the ground or in wood or in whatever, and lay their eggs separately without help from other workers or anything like that. They're just solitary bees, and so on. But these bumblebees that we're focusing on tonight, they are colonial bees. They're not as colonial as, say, some of the ants or the termites or honeybees. They're social, like this little nest here shows, but they're what we call primitively eusocial. And that's just a fancy way of saying they're all social. They have these workers, but all the workers are fertile females too. They could have babies of their own if the kind of social situation changed and the nest, if they were able to. So, but they all work together. They're all sisters here, the workers, and then help their mother raise their brothers and sisters. Bumblebees are important, what we call buzz pollinators. As you know, bees buzz, and bumblebees buzz more than other bees. And they're really important, especially for members of the blueberry family, like these little lingonberries on top of a hill near my house here in Whitehorse, and for members of the tomato and squash families. And these plants, they don't release their pollen easily, or they don't just offer it up to bees. The flowers have to be shaken to release the pollen, and then bumblebees are needed for this. Honeybees could do this, but they're not as good at it. So without the bumblebees, you wouldn't get these nice lingonberries, or what we call low bush cranberries here in Whitehorse. And for tomato and cucumbers and crops like that in these greenhouses, bumblebee pollination is really needed to make sure we get all those tomatoes we get in our greenhouses. And we'll come back to this story later because it has a lot to do with the conservation of bumblebees. What bumblebees are not, and this is the most important message of what they are not this. They are not honeybees. And I'm saying this because a lot of people get mixed up, and there's a lot of mixed messages in the media, a lot of misinformation out there on social media. Honeybees in North America are a farm animal. They are wonderful. If you like honey and you want your crops pollinated, they really work hard. They're busy bees, and they give us a lot. but they are like chickens. They are the chickens of the bee world in North America, at least. They are a farm animal, and we love them dearly, but we don't, when we talk about bird conservation, we don't think of chickens. And I just want to get that point across, that we're talking now about native bees, the bumblebees and these other bees, not honeybees. That's not to say bumblebees do make honey. They're very closely related to honeybees. And I'll just go over their little bumblebee year here, just to show you that, how it works. So we'll start at the top here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor? I guess I can't see what.
Yes, we can see.
Anyways, so the queen comes out in the spring, in the early spring, when things are just beginning, when the first flowers are blooming, and starts her own little nest here in the ground. Usually it's in the ground. Sometimes it's in a bird box or in some other kind of structure that's got a cavity in it and so on. But usually it's in an abandoned rodent or rabbit burrow or something that allows them to live in a little cavity in the ground. And so she lays her eggs in the ground and makes these little, they're not really like honeycombs, but they're like little cells that she lays her eggs in. And then she goes out to the flowers, the early flowers. Up here in Whitehorse, it's willows and pussy willows and things like that, and gathers pollen and nectar and feeds her young those. And it's a really vital time of the year for her because she's on her own. The weather can be, iffy. It can, up here it can snow or it can rain or it can, and even down in Victoria where it's all wonderful, you can get really good spring storms and it can be cool and wet for days and days on end. And so things can get delayed, and many nests fail at this stage. Perhaps most nests fail at this stage. And so only a few succeed to carry on to have successfully rear the first generation of workers. And once that is underway in early summer, those first generation of workers start going out and foraging on the flowers themselves and bringing back pollen for their younger brothers and sisters who are the little grubs in the cells at that time. And you can have one or even two generations of workers before late summer comes along. And in the late summer, the males and the females, the queens and the drones for the next generation emerge at the end of the summer. And in Whitehorse, I can assure you that's mid-July. So it's relatively short up here, but down in Victoria, I'm sure it'll be mid to late August, perhaps. So that's what we're talking about, late summer there, maybe even into early September. And so they mate. The queens take that sperm and then they go and find a cozy place to spend the winter. And they stay underground. Or not maybe underground, but in a really sheltered place, under leaves, under logs, in hollow logs, something like that for the winter, out of the way, and hibernate, and then come out again the next spring. And the whole thing starts again. So what do bumblebees need in their world? The main thing, because they're a social insect, because they depend on this colony surviving and growing through the whole season, they need flowers through the entire season. A lot of these little solitary bees just need a few weeks of a certain flower to feed their young. But these bumblebees require flowers all through the season. And that means they need a diversity of flowers because there's no one flower that's there all the time. So in Whitehorse here, for example, they start off on willow catkins. You never think of willow catkins, or I didn't anyways, as being a kind of a bee flower. But if you look closely at some of them, they're red and yellow and filled with nectar and pollen, and they're just alive with bees in the spring. But in Victoria, you would have all those nice early spring blooms, in the Garry Oak meadows and so on that the bees would come to. These bumblebees are therefore they're generalist feeders. They have to adapt to what's out there. They have their choices. They have their preferences. They love raspberries. They don't like this or that, but they need them throughout the season. So in Whitehorse, they start with these willows. They go on to dandelions. Then they switch to maybe some peas, like these loco weed. Some bumblebees have really long tongues. Some species have long tongues and some have short tongues. So they specialize a little bit in that sense. This is a high country bumblebee up in the Haines Road of BC going into a deep local weed. Later on in the season up here, we get fireweed, and the bees love fireweed. And then finally, they don't care if it's an invasive species or not. They love things like white sweet clover. So my main point is here, you need flowers through the season. Of course, in Victoria, that's not a problem. You got trillions of them, according to the flower counts. And also, as I mentioned before, they need these rodent burrows or other underground places that are not disturbed so that they can raise their young in a safe, dry place. And they need a cozy place to hibernate. It's, gets down to minus 20 at night here in Whitehorse right now, but all those queen bees are safe and sound under the snow, curled up under the leaves, waiting for next spring. And they do that in Victoria as well. They're all out of the way right now, but they'll come out in the first warm days of spring, perhaps even in late January or February down there. So just a little bit about bumblebees in British Columbia. There's 33, as I said, there's 430 bees or something like that, 435. In bumblebee land, there's 33 native species known, plus one that's been introduced accidentally. So that's just to say that 33 is a nice number, it's like compared to birds, which are like 10 times that, theoretically you could learn your bumblebees pretty quickly, if you paid attention and went out there. It's not a, I don't want to discourage you. I think this is a great idea and I would urge you to do this, but identification can be challenging. And I think, I'm sure I saw Leah Ramsey's name there on the list, and Dave Fraser's probably listening with her. But I remember when Dave and I first got this guide, the draft of this guide, we sat down at the museum and tried to use it, and it was just horrifically difficult. And so identification can be challenging. And here's just an example of 5 species that are in southern BC. They all look kind of the same to me, and they mimic each other because they're big stinging insects. They get this, what's called Mullerian mimicry, so that birds and other things don't have to learn more than once. And so it can be challenging just to use these, what seem to be obvious patterns, to identify them. So you have to look carefully. The good news is there's a guide. It's a few years old now. And you can see this is Bombus huntii, the Hunt's bumblebee on the cover, and this is the one showing its patterns on the left. The bad news is it's still challenging. And I have some, this guide is wonderful, but it is designed, the identification keys in it are a bit challenging for the beginner. And I think we can perhaps make it a bit easier in the next go round. But there is a guide, and it's got great pictures and maps and all sorts of good things to help you through your identification challenges. So what do you do when you see a bee? Like, what are you looking for? Well, it's like a bird. It's like bird watching. You're looking for a number of things. What are the patterns you see? Is there orange on the abdomen, or is it just yellow? That's one of the first things I look at when I bee. Is there orange? Because as soon as there's orange, I know it's one of these whole groups called Pyrobombus, and I know which, it knocks the species in half. So you know that. So where is it orange? Is it orange in the middle? Is it orange in the back? Where is the yellow? These are simple questions, of course. Is the face, and then you got to look at the face. And is the face long or short? That's a bit tougher, and that takes a bit of experience. Are there pollen baskets? Like, or is it gathering pollen? Because if there isn't, then that tells you something too. And where am I? After all those questions, you can say, where am I? But where am I, as you know, is one of the first questions you should ask yourself when you're a naturalist trying to identify anything, because you automatically narrow the number of species down tremendously if you're in a very particular place. There's also questions to ask. Everybody makes these mistakes, and I did too. And it's very easy to ask, is this even a bumblebee? No, this one isn't. This is a fly. This is a hoverfly. up on the Haines Road, Volucella, beautiful bumblebee mimic. These flies don't sting. They just want you to think they're a stinging big bumblebee. Here's another one on the Haines Road, a different genus of hoverflies called Aristolus. And here's a caribou botfly, a warble fly up in the Mackenzie Mountains of the Northwest Territories. Looks just like a big bee. And John Reynolds took this picture. I stole it off iNaturalist. John, if you're there, this is a beautiful big robber fly in the Skagit Valley called Laphria fernalde, looking like a big bumblebee. And this one, just another one from a garden in Victoria, the Narcissus bulbfly. This is a pest on your daffodils in the spring, but it looks like a big fluffy bee. So that's just to say, look carefully, see if you can see I should maybe, when you're looking at to see whether it's a fly or a bee, look at the antennae. Flies have only one pair of wings and bees have two, but that's really hard to see sometimes. But you can see on this bee-like thing, there's very tiny, tiny, tiny antennae. You can hardly see them. This one, the tiny antennae, there's probably no antennae there. I don't know where they are. And on this big robber fly, there's these little stubby ones here, right here. But, little tiny stubby ones here on this bulb fly. But on a bumblebee, they're long, and you can see on these bumblebees, the antennae are long and stick out like that. And so that's one of the easiest ways to tell. That and these big pollen baskets too on their legs. Anyway, so that's just to say it's trickier than just the bumblebees. So here's 6. I asked Dave Fraser to nominate the 6 common bumblebees of Victoria, and these are the ones that he suggested. I just thought I'd go over them. You can see that most of them are these orange kind, which doesn't help much, does it? But if you know these 6, you'll know like over 95% of the bumblebees you see in your garden. So here we'll start with the Vancouver bumblebee, Bombus vancouverensis. It actually should be the Vancouver Island bumblebee because that's what the vancouverensis refers to. In your book, it would be the 2-form bumblebee, but it's recently been split so that you get your Vancouver name out of it. How to tell this one? This is a very distinctive one. It's got these beautiful pale yellow stripes on it and a big black gap in the middle here, which makes it look like 2 shoulder blades on either side. And then these nice black and orange patterns. Sometimes the orange is missing. Anyways, it's quite a distinctive one. I'll move on. The yellow-fronted bumblebee, and this is a widespread, the Vancouver one and the yellow-fronted one and the black-tailed one are all widespread through BC. It doesn't matter where you're listening from. If you're in the Okanagan, these ones will all be there. The yellow-fronted bumblebee, the distinctive thing about that, it does have a yellow front, but you can see these other ones do as well. But it also has this broad yellow on the base of the abdomen, 2 big segments worth of yellow on the abdomen, whereas these ones just have little tiny front end yellows. So if you see an abdomen that looks half yellow, it's probably a yellow fronted bumblebee. You don't have to remember all this, of course. I'm just trying to say how you can identify them. It is possible. The black-tailed bumblebee does have a black tail, but so does the yellow-fronted in a sense. But you can see that it's got a very narrow yellow band on the abdomen before the big orange patch. And then the yellow on the front of the thorax here, right behind the head, is really a kind of a dirty olive color. It's hardly yellow at all. So that's the black-tailed. And then you guys on the coast get the Sitka bumblebee. We don't get that up here in Whitehorse, but it's a coastal one like its name suggests. And it's got this sort of same dull yellow at the front of the thorax. And but then just sort of pale yellowy olive on the abdomen, nothing orange, nothing fancy. It kind of like some of these coastal things, they're kind of dull and gray looking, but a very common bee on the coast. And then there's the fuzzy horned bumblebee, which looks a bit like the yellow fronted, but it's got this black band between the orange and the yellow, and the whole end of the abdomen is orange. It's not black. And then the vast majority of the bees you'll see will be this yellow-faced bumblebee. So I'll say a bit more about that right now. This is your yellow-faced bumblebee, which right at the moment, if first thing next year when you get out, this is going to be the bumblebee you'll likely see in your garden. But back when I lived in Vancouver and when I moved to Victoria back in the early 90s, this was not a thing at all. This was not a bee of Victoria or Vancouver or anywhere. And in fact, when I was working at the Conservation Data Center in the 90s, this was one of the bees that we were considering sort of like putting on the endangered species list. It was known from one site in the South Okanagan in British Columbia, in Canada for that matter. And there was another record which we weren't aware of at the time from the 1970s, I think, from Burnaby. So it was very rare. But in the 90s, and Dave Fraser can chime in later to tell us more about, because he and Claudia and others have done some research on this and figured out what's going on, or tried to figure out what's going on. But in the 90s, a few of them were brought in to pollinate those greenhouse plants, and they weren't intentionally released, but some of them may have got out, or it may be just like the house finch moving up from California, which is where it's naturally from, California and Oregon. And for whatever reason, in the 90s, it started to appear in small numbers in the Vancouver area, but it was still rare, even at 2000 in the Lower Mainland. And in Victoria, it didn't show up until 2005. I think Claudia was amongst the first people to find it there, I think at Thetis Lake or somewhere on the peninsula. And so that was 2005, it first showed up. But by 2010, it was one of the common bumblebees certainly of the Lower Mainland. It was the dominant one and one of the common ones in Victoria. And so for whatever reason, whether it came in, whether we helped bring it in, it's one of these bees that is very productive. It produces hundreds of workers and at the end can produce over 100 queens from one nest. So you can see if things are going good, it can really populate an area quickly. It also, and friends, there's another little trick here. As I said, most of them will be this one. There are 3 very similar looking species, but the good news is this Caliginosus is not known from Victoria. Van Dykii, I think, is only known from the Okanagan now, but it's got the little yellow stripe just a little bit further forward than this one if you look carefully. So you got to look carefully, but 99.99999% of them will be Vosnesenskii, this yellow-fronted bumblebee, yellow-faced bumblebee. Vos, as we call it. On the other side of the spectrum, there are 4 bees that we consider at risk in British Columbia that have been assessed by CSIWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And one of them is this western bumblebee. And this used to be the common bumblebee, or one of the 2 or 3 common bumblebees of Victoria, but you didn't see that on that top 6 list there because it isn't anymore. It's still in Victoria, and but it's very, very uncommon, I guess. I know my brother Rob saw one last year, and every once in a while you hear of people seeing 1 or 2, you know, so only a few are seen every season now, but they are still there. And we're going to talk more about why these things might be at risk in a few minutes, but this is the western bumblebee. This is a male bumblebee up in Manning Park last summer. The yellow banded bumblebee, a close relative of the western bumblebee. The gypsy cuckoo and the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee are the other 2. And like their name suggests, these are nest parasites, and they happen to choose these top 2, the western and the yellow banded, as their hosts. And so as their host goes, so go the cuckoos. So I'm just going to say a bit more about each of these in the next little bit. The western bumblebee, and here's a photo by Jeremy Gatton taken up on West Saanich Road, for those of you who are from Victoria. Know that area. This was taken a couple of years ago, I think. So just to show they're still there. So keep an eye open for these guys. This is now considered to be threatened in Canada. Its numbers have gone from, like perhaps 30% of the bumblebees you would have seen in Victoria would have been this bee in the 1980s. And now, as I said, very, very, very few. So to identify these, because they're still around, you can see it's got a black head, basically an all black face and head. It's got this yellow band behind the head on the thorax. It's got a mostly black back to the thorax and an all black abdomen, except for the rear end, which is white. And so it's quite distinctive. There's nothing, there's very few other bumblebees that look quite like this, especially in the Victoria area. So keep an eye open for those, the Western bumblebee. And up north here, we have another subspecies of the Western bumblebee called the Mackay's bumblebee. And it's been assessed as special concern because didn't suffer that same decline, but we're concerned that it might follow in its southern brother's footsteps. But up north, they're a bit shaggier. They've got a yellow band. They don't have a real white bum, and there's other differences. But they're both very closely related to this one, the yellow banded bumblebee, which is the eastern sibling to these western ones. And it's been assessed as special concern. It has big declines in southern Ontario and southern Quebec, but it seems to be doing fine in the north. It's a boreal thing, goes right across the north. Here's a map to show you the yellow banded bumblebee is in blue here. If you can see my cursor, this big blue blob across much of Canada is the yellow banded bumblebee's range. The Western bumblebee is the red and the green here in the west. The red is that northern subspecies. The green is the southern one. So you can see 2/3 to 3/4 of the way up BC. They change quite quickly. That you can go from one land to the other there. But they're all very closely related. At one time, they were all considered one species, east, west, everything. But genetics and other things have shown that the eastern and western ones are separate. And to be honest, I think this northern one might eventually be considered a separate subspecies for both genetic reasons and pheromone reasons, and things like that are showing that it's a different thing. So we'll see how that goes. But they're all quite closely related. And another close relative of theirs, the rusty patch bumblebee, which in Canada was only known from primarily known from this yellow circle area here, southern Ontario. It's now essentially gone from Canada. It's really in trouble, and it's even really in trouble in the Midwest in the United States, where it still remains. And all these bumblebees are closely related. They're all in this one subgenus called Bombus. And for whatever reason, they're all going down big time. On the other hand, the exception proves the rule. They do have another close relative in that same subgenus, the Cryptic Bumblebee. And this is one of the other common bumblebees of my yard in Whitehorse. But it doesn't get down as far as Victoria. It's whole Arctic. It goes all the way from Ireland right across Asia and into Alaska and the Yukon and into northern BC, down the Rockies as far as Banff, but doesn't get further south than that. And it's doing, for whatever reason, it's doing totally fine. So it's not just the genes there. So as I mentioned before, these bumblebees in the subgenus Bombus, and I'll talk a bit about why they're threatened in a minute, but there's these other two cuckoo bumblebees, and they're like cowbirds or cuckoos. They take over another bumblebee nest and lay their eggs in it, and the workers of that nest rear their young. So they don't have workers of their own. They just have they produce drones and queens at the end of the summer and take over these other bee nests. So the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee is the western one. It goes up and down the western mountains primarily. It was really common in southern BC. Gets up into the north, it gets a bit rare, but it's found all across Canada. It's just very rare. It's always been rare in the east. And its sibling is the Gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. It's a thing that was common in the east, less common in the west. And it's been assessed as endangered because its numbers have declined so much, especially in the heart of its range in eastern Canada. It's whole Arctic. It's found all across. It's found all across Asia. And the funny thing is, even though it's been really decimated in eastern North America, where it's essentially gone, it's still common. It's one of the common cuckoo bumblebees of Europe. So it's not just human development that's causing this. And so this is one of the bumblebees I'm working on, developing a recovery strategy and identifying critical habitat and so on. So this is just a map to show you these little white circles are where it used to be. These are old sites. These are all older than 10 years old. The blue ones here, the blue green ones or whatever that color is, are newer sightings, and the pinky purple magenta ones are newer sightings in outside of Canada in the United States. So you can see in the northwest here, it's still doing fine. There's no problem really up here as far as we can tell. It's still present in Alberta and southern BC, but these are tricky. These represent a huge effort to sample bumblebees. So they represent like 10 bees found out of like 10,000 bees sampled. So it's really rare down here, but it still exists. It hasn't been found anywhere across here recently, but that may be because they're not sampling as intensively as they are in Alberta. And you can see there's a couple of recent records in the eastern north, in the New England area. And last summer, someone took a photograph of one and put it up on iNaturalist near Rimouski in Quebec. So it's still in the eastern part of North America, but very, very rare. And that's because its host here, the yellow-banded bumblebee, and especially in this area here in southern Ontario, the rusty patch bumblebee have really, really vanished. And so they have no host to parasitize. So the declines, this is the western bumblebee declines, began primarily in the 1980s and early 1990s. So this is from southern Alberta, this line here, if you want to look at some real graph. We don't have the data back before 1985 here, unfortunately, but it would be essentially a pretty stable line to the left here. But then starting in mid 1980s, there was a real decline, and it just kept on going down and down and down and down until 2010. And after that, they just couldn't find them anymore in this study in southern Alberta. So something hit them right in the mid 80s. It looked like right there. Something started right then. So that's a good date to know. So what caused these? Well, there is no single cause. There is no smoking gun. We can't say for sure what caused them, but the pointing fingers are pointing to start to point at these fungal pathogens, these microsporidia. And these are single-celled fungi-like organisms, like yeasts. They're not yeast, but they're like that. And there's one called Nosema bombi, which is the bumblebee parasite. And these are parasites that were always in bumblebees. They're not new. They're not from foreign lands. They're not from China or from Europe. They're from North America, and they can deform wings. They decrease the survival of workers. They prevent queens from mating, and they generally cause the colonies to fail. And the most important thing to know is that starting, like in the 2000s, when they were starting to look at these parasites in more detail, they were far more abundant in the declining species, like the western bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee and the rusty patch bumblebee. These parasites, these pathogens, were massively infecting these particular species of bumblebees, as opposed to other common bumblebees seemed to be just fine and had very few of these. So for whatever reasons, these particular species can't handle the pathogens. But why was there a big increase in there? Why would this have caused declines of these bumblebees? So that's the next question. And the other thing that happened at that time is not only there was a huge increase in the amount of pathogens, but it coincided with this sudden use of managed bumblebees in greenhouses. Before the 1980s, there was no bumblebee industry where bees were farmed like honeybees and packaged up, and greenhouse operators released them in greenhouses to pollinate their crops. That didn't happen before the 80s. And so this was a new technique developed then. And bees like the western bumblebee were used in western greenhouses, but the western bumblebee, as we soon found out, didn't do very well. It could be reared, but it soon got sick and died. So they started using the common eastern bumblebee, which is not a close relative despite its name. And that's the one used to this day across Canada in greenhouses. And the eastern bumblebee can handle these parasites just fine, whereas the western bumblebee gets very sick. So we think what's happening is, and there is some evidence to show this, that these pathogens get into the greenhouse bees. The greenhouse bees are all living in close quarters, and then some of them get very sick, and then some of them escape and go out and infect the bumblebees out in the outside world. And there is evidence to show that the amount of pathogens closer to greenhouses is higher. At any rate, when this big industry took off, the amount of pathogens increased dramatically, and these 3 species of bumblebees really declined very quickly. The other things that are contributing probably to the declines, but may not be the direct cause of the original decline, are similar pathogens that honeybees bring. They're close relatives. They have closely related pathogens. Viruses and other disease can be transferred to bumblebees simply by the honeybee here goes to a flower and collects the pollen and leaves some saliva behind, and so on. Doesn't wear a mask. Honeybees are also really efficient workers. They're busy bees, and they can outcompete native bees for limited pollen and nectar. This is a picture taken in Europe here, but this is a standard apiary in Europe of 40 or so honeybee frames. And a colony of honeybees of this size can collect 400 kilos of pollen in 3 months. 400 kilos of pollen, just that little yellow dust. So that's a lot of pollen, and that's all collected within probably a kilometer or much less of this colony. So you can see that in this sort of situation where there's a big operation of honeybees for any length of time, there's not a lot of pollen left for native bees. But it's probably more up in Canada and other places like that where there's a lot more perhaps native flowers, and then there's probably fewer honeybees in most cases. It's perhaps more important early in the season when flowers may be more limiting than in the summer. A lot of attention has lately been paid too on insecticides. Of course, we heard a lot about these neonicotinoids, the new wonder pesticides, insecticides developed, which are used prophylactically in many cases. So that's part of the problem. They're used even when there isn't a problem. They're just sprayed on the trees or coated on the seeds of the crops before there's even a problem. Just to the insecticides are then inside the plant, inside the soybean, inside the corn plant, and so the bugs that try to chew on them are killed. But neonicotinoids were tested and don't kill, at field realistic levels, they don't kill bees. They did all these tests and the bees didn't die, and so they were deemed safe. But when you look at bumblebees that are there all season long, even if it's very small doses of these neonicotinoids, if they're doing it for weeks at a time, they get impaired learning, they lose short-term memory, which of course, when you're foraging, it's not good. You don't know where to go to find what you had last time. You don't even know sometimes where your little nest is when you're trying to go home. There's reduced queen production. The bees tend to stay out longer foraging and forget to come back on time. So the young are growing more slowly. And ultimately, there's colony failure. So there is evidence to show that these neonicotinoids do really impact bumblebees and other pollinators. But the fact is, these neonicotinoids were really introduced about 10 years after these declines really happened. So it wasn't them, they didn't cause those big declines initially. They may not helping it now, helping them come back. And there's now talk of cutting back on neonicotinoids and replacing them, but there's sulfoxaflor and chlorantraniliprole that are touted. But these have now been shown to also reduce productions in bees and cause lethargy. And in our forest industry, there's insecticides used, especially back east, where the gypsy moth lives. There's a common chemical called tebufenazide. And in honeybees, this causes learning deficiencies. But there's very few studies, but one study I read there was no effects on bumblebee production. So that we still don't know much there. Herbicides are another thing, like herbicides, you'd think, how could they kill bees? They're designed to kill plants. Well, just, first of all, the amount of herbicides we're using now is tremendously higher than it was, a few decades ago. With a lot of corn, especially corn, soy, and canola crops are now genetically modified herbicide ready, so they don't get affected by the herbicides. But so the herbicides are put on to control weeds, and the amount has doubled just since 2005. So here's a picture in the Fraser Valley. So you can see the corn isn't a very bee-friendly crop anyways, like there's nothing in there for the bees. But along the roadside here, you can see the little green areas here. If herbicides are used, there's not going to be any flowers there for the bees to forage on, which is a prime. This could even, improve bee habitat if you had lots of flowers along those road edges and between the crops. But when you're using herbicide-ready crops, that's not likely going to happen. And of course, it's used a fair amount in silviculture and growing trees. They spray some clear cuts to give the little baby trees a bit of a head start so that they can grow up fast. There's a little recent research, but my gut feeling is that this, it's not great. I mean, it kills the flowers, so they have fewer flowers to eat, but it probably wouldn't cause population level declines. Finally, the last kind of pesticide we use a lot of in North America are fungicides. It's really kind of stunning to know how much fungicides are used on crops. And they're not necessarily toxic to bees, just by themselves. But when someone did this massive big study across the United States to see what environmental factors were correlated with bee declines and with these pathogens, they looked at yellow-banded bumblebees and western bumblebees, and the strongest predictor of the prevalence of those pathogens in the bumblebees was the amount of fungicide, particularly this one called chlorothalonil. And so that's a very interesting finding. It's not shown that it was actually the fungicide that weakened the bees or whatever to cause them to be more susceptible to these pathogens, or whether chlorothalonil is just simply another measure of how intensive the agriculture is in that area. And so it might be some general intensive agriculture phenomenon that's making the bees a little more susceptible to these pathogens. Finally, of course, there's the obvious thing: habitat loss, conversions of meadows and woodlands and margins where the bees love to find their flowers and nest and so on. Loss of flowers, loss of nesting and and hibernation. That's obviously true, and certainly in a small part of the bees range in Canada, like this area near Toronto, southern Ontario, lower Fraser Valley and things like that, and downtown Victoria, that can be a major factor. But throughout most of the range of bees, that wouldn't cause these big declines that we're seeing. Finally, there's climate change. Now, bees are cool adapted insects. They're big, they're furry, they're designed to operate at low temperatures. That's one of their advantages. They can sort of shiver and get warm, and the queens can get out early on spring days and get going when it's quite cool out. But when it gets really, really hot, they run into trouble. The bumblebees as a whole group are only in the northern part of the world, in the northern hemisphere, especially in the mountains. Their biggest diversity is in the Himalaya and the Tibetan Plateau. They also go down the mountains of North America into Central and South America, but in very small, little narrow band. They're not a tropical thing at all. So they're cool adapted. They don't like it hot. And there's recent research that shows, that heat waves, especially in Southern Europe, are causing massive loss of bumblebees down there. And these are maps to show our Gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, again, to show the changes just in modeling the climate envelopes of this species in Europe, you can see the red and yellow gets much bigger by the end of the century here, and the yellow and the green is confined to that far north. And there's evidence, sorry, I'll just go back to that one. There's evidence now, even in North America, to show that bumblebees are losing range at the southern end of their range and not apparently gaining it at the northern edge as quickly. So their range is shrinking in the face of climate change. So, but to sum it all up, it's probably just not one thing or the other. It might have been these pathogens, but that pathogens might be affected by pesticides and by climate change and stresses of loss of habitat and so on. And so it might be the cumulative effect of all these things together that's causing these declines. To make matters worse, just to finish up the bad news story here, is that bumblebees, just like all the other bees and wasps, have a very different way, different means of determining sex, determining gender than mammals do. In bumblebees, the females come from fertilized eggs. They're diploid. They have the genes from both their mother and their father. The males are haploid. They have only half the genes. They have only genes from their mother. So they're from unfertilized eggs. So that works, you know. So if the queen lays a bunch of eggs and half of them have been fertilized and half not, she'll get half females and half males, and they'll go off and be the next generation. But the trouble is, there's another catch in a female. If the two pairs of she's got two sets of genes, two sets of chromosomes, there's one gene that determines whether she'll be fertile or not, and it has to be different on each of those chromosomes. So if the population is very low in genetic diversity, the chances of those two chromosomes being the same are much higher. And if that gene is the same on both the chromosome that the mother, I'm getting a bit mixed up here now, but the queen got genes from her mother and her father, right? So if the father and the mother share exactly the same copy of that gene, and she passes that along, the progeny would be sterile males. So if the genes have to be diverse in order to produce fertile females. And it's not a problem in the normal bumblebee population because there's many, many, many different copies of these genes. But as the population gets very small, the genes become much more alike, and these fertile, or the females will actually develop as sterile males, which of course is not a good thing. Less diversity, more sterility. I didn't explain that very well, but that's the take-home message. And populations are therefore really susceptible to extinction when populations get small. And this is called the extinction vortex in bumblebees. So that is, it gets very small, it gets really impossible to produce productive colonies. So what can we do? We can, it's not all bad news, and some of this is already starting to happen. We can start to really manage the bee industries, and they've already got their own best practices and so on. And if you follow those, then we should be fine. Prevent escapes from greenhouses, limit the size of honeybee apiaries, especially on wild lands, make sure that the bees that the greenhouses are getting from the bee factories are all disease-free. And of course, use these pesticides only when necessary. So that's the sort of bad news side and what we can do. But I just wanted to go on now just a bit to what we people as naturalists can do to keep track of things, to monitor things. And we're really good at this. Of course, we go on Christmas bird counts and do all sorts of breeding bird surveys and flower surveys and things like that. We can do that for bumblebees as well. And two of the easiest ways to do that are to just go out and take lots of pictures of bumblebees. And as you can see by those photographs I mentioned before and what is needed to identify bumblebees, it's really good to take more than one picture, because one picture of a bumblebee might just show the rear end of it diving down the flower. It won't show the head, it won't show the face, it won't show the side, and so on. And so it'd be good, bumblebees, as you know, when you're watching them in the flower, they're just running around in it and coming in and out of it. But nowadays, the good news is we've got these digital cameras, and we can take 5 or 10 pictures of one bumblebee on a flower, and then you just post them all up to one of these 2 sites. There's a iNaturalist.ca. I know a lot of you are already into iNaturalist, and if you put your pictures up on iNaturalist, I can guarantee that one of the world experts on bumblebees, John Asher, will probably identify it probably within 4 hours, but maybe within a day. Bumblebee Watch is another one, led by more bumblebee people. And they have a team of experts too that look at those photographs and help identify them. And they all get pulled together and collated, and the data can be used to see how bumblebees are doing, where they are, how common they are, and so on. It's not really good for bumblebee counting, but it's really a good idea as to which species are still common enough for people to take pictures. And certainly for the rare ones, they show up on these sites more than an expert bumblebee person going out looking for them on their own can find them. So, either way, whichever one you want to contribute to, you can do both. You can put your pictures up on both of these sites. Take lots of pictures and share them. They'll be very welcome. In addition to that, we still really need trend data. When Dave Fraser and I were at these Kasiwak meetings looking at these bumblebee data, we knew there'd been declines. We knew the bumblebees were in trouble, but we didn't really have a good, solid data from across the whole range. We had this little study from the Fraser Valley or this little study from Toronto, and showed that things were really dire, but we really had no idea we had no proof that it was doing badly in central Alberta or northern BC or anywhere. So what we needed was a cross Canada, cross range survey to keep track of bumblebees. And Dave and I looked at each other and went, hey, we need the bee equivalent of the breeding bird survey. And it's got the same initials, the Bumblebee Survey, the BBS. So, many of you already go out counting birds every spring along roads, getting up at 3:30 in the morning, stopping 50 times, doing all this stuff. We can do the same for bees, only you don't have to get up early in the morning. You can do it in the middle of the summer when it's nice and warm. And you can get all sorts of data. And I can talk to you, if you're interested in this, please, get a hold of me outside this meeting, or I can pass along to the VNHS people, and you can tell them that you're interested. But this is just an example of 1 year in the Yukon. We went out and we did this, I think, at 10 different, along 10, we used the same survey routes as breeding bird surveys. So you can see the one, you can't really see these names at all, but the one on the left here, this tallest column, this is the relative abundance of all the species. So here's a species that's over 20%. Guess what it is? The Western bumblebee. And so we know in the Yukon, it's still okay. It's doing fine. Down here, these little ones here, they look like they're really rare, but what's this? This is the Gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. And here's the Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee. So they're much rarer, but we expect them to be rarer than their host. So, but what we do know is that they're still there and we're still finding them, not like some places in southeastern Canada. So in one season with only 10 surveys, we've found something quite interesting there. So it'd be great to have all these done all across Canada. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to you guys and say thank you very much. And Stephanie, we can figure out how to do the questioning thing.
There we go. I'm unmuting myself. All right. Thank you. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. We just have one question so far in the chat. If other people, which I will read to you in a moment, if other people would like to add their questions in the chat, or we can also, have a discussion, or you can ask in person. So we have one question here. It was regarding the iNaturalist and other citizen science apps. Is it possible to record absence data? Seems important for skilled folks to be able to record zeros. So basically that the recording not just the presence of a bumblebee, but that you went out and put in a lot of effort searching and did not find anything.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Of course, zero and absence data is always really important and often difficult to get. But where we can get absence data in, like in bird watching, we get absence data when we go out and do eBird lists, right? And we submit a list and we say, this is all the birds I saw. And if a bird's not on that list, it was, quote, absent from that survey. It wasn't necessarily even absent from that area, but it was absent. So we know we can get zero data from those. But on iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch, which rely on photographs for the record, that's not the way it works. And so that's what would be useful, for example, in that kind of survey that I mentioned there. It's much more like a bird survey, right? So the absence of a species on that list shows you that it's either absent or it's uncommon enough that we didn't see it. Amongst 700 bees, we didn't see it. So that would be the only way to get absence data, is to do those surveys. And the people in the States are trying to come up with all sorts of ways that naturalists can survey bumblebees and not kill them, and yet get good identifications of them. And it's very, very difficult, as I've tried to point out, that identification is often, it's like birds, many of them are easy to identify, but some of them are really difficult. Like you really have to have a superb photograph, or you have to kill them and have the specimen in your hand and see what that spine on that last leg looks like, or what the spine on the end of the abdomen looks like in under 30 power microscope. So the surveys that I do involve killing bees, which is unfortunate, but it doesn't harm the populations, because the populations are in the tens of thousands, and we're killing a much tiny percentage of that. So, but it's a way of getting a sample of what's out there. But to answer that question, I don't know of a way with iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch to get zero data.
Thank you. Syd, would you like me to read off the questions to you?
Sure, why not? I can. Oh, there's a lot all of a sudden.
Yeah, there's some more here. Okay, so I'll just read them out loud for you and for everyone's benefit, so you don't have to open the chat. So another question is, how can we change gardening or landscaping to enhance habitat for bumblebees?
Well, hi, Sue. Well, we can change gardening to enhance habitat for bumblebees. The main, I think, message is that we need flowers through the season. That's one thing, right? And I'm sure there's many books out there, or many guides, or many online resources to say what are good flowers for bumblebees, but they're pretty generalist in all bumblebees. There's different, if you want to get other particular bees, then it gets a little bit more complicated, but it's not really complicated. Basically, flowers through the season, and make your garden really, have it messy, like allow places where there are little hollows and little burrows, and allow a lot of stuff to build up so that they can winter underneath the leaves, or under an old log or something like that. There are designs just for bumblebee houses, like bird boxes that you can actually put in the ground. But I guess the same thing with bird boxes too. We can put up a lot of bird boxes, and some of them aren't used. But if you put up enough of them, you do get used. I think the common numbers I've heard are like 1 in 10 of these boxes gets used. So it's not vastly increasing the habitat for bumblebees, but it does allow you to watch. It's kind of like, we kind of know what's in our garden that way. So I would say keep your landscaping messy and filled with flowers through the season, from early on till late, and have places for them to nest and to spend the winter.
Great, thank you. Here's another one from Don Kramer. Is it reasonable to capture bees for photos and then release them? I tried taking photos, but found I didn't have the information needed to follow the guide.
Yeah, it is. It's really difficult. Yeah, people do this, and there's a lot of survey protocols that involve this. You catch them, put them in a little clear vial, and then you they tend to cool the bee down, like you have a cooler with you. So then you have to cool the bee down, and then you bring it out and take a bunch of pictures, as many as you can, of this one bee in a clear vial, and then let it go. And so I think that works kind of most of the time. But then I've seen lots of discussions between bumblebee experts going, "What is this bee?" And they're all arguing. All the experts are arguing, and then there's eventually maybe a consensus. But just to identify one bee took many people like several hours. And so I'm not trying to discourage this, but some of the Pacific Northwest Bee Survey in Oregon uses this protocol, I think, for part of it. So it's possible. It's just not possible. There will be a few bees that you can't identify. To tell, for example, Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee and the Gypsy cuckoo bumblebee apart really requires looking at the tip of the female's abdomen or the tip of the male's abdomen to be sure. There are other pattern differences, but you really have to have them in your hand. Sorry.
Okay, next question is, do all the workers die each year and only the queen survive?
That would be yes. That's an easy one. Yeah, so yeah, and each queen then starts a totally new colony in a new place. And then she goes out and finds they don't nest in the same spot every year.
And another question. I have seen quite a few individual bumblebees disabled. They can't fly but twirl around on the ground. What would cause this? I've seen that too.
Yeah, I don't know. If it's not cold, if it's cold, they could just be cold. But if it's not cold, then they might be suffering from some insecticide problem. I don't know. Um, I don't know if there's a pathogen or something that causes anything like that either, but I would expect that it's probably, if it isn't cold, like if it's cold, they just, like often, especially in the fall, or the late summer, you'll just see bees hanging around in flowers and you can just pick them up and they're just stunned. And often there may not even be that cold, but they're just at that, I don't know, if it's been a cold night, it takes them a while to warm up and they don't bother warming up, then especially males, I find just very dozy a lot of the time. Or if that, I don't know if that's, I don't know the answer in that.
I guess, would you be able to tell a bee that's sick from insecticides or fungicides or herbicides?
No, I'm not an expert in that. Sorry, but generally speaking, if I see an insect lying on its back, sort of twitching, I think insecticides. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is about the term herbicide ready, and wondering if it's glyphosate.
Well, glyphosate is a type of herbicide. So herbicide ready means the plant is genetically modified, like the corn plant or the soybean plant, the crop is genetically modified so that it's resistant to glyphosate or some other herbicide. And so herbicide ready is the crop, and then glyphosate is then the chemical you spray on the crop, not to kill the crop, but to kill anything else growing with the crop. So you don't have to go out and pull weeds or, harrow the ground between the rows to control the weeds. So it just gives your plants full reign on the soil without competing with other weeds, as we call them. So that's why they're called herbicide ready. And glyphosate has been one of the main ones of the herbicides used. It's been used so much now that some of these weedy plants are now resistant to it, and so they're creating new genetically modified crops that are resistant to different herbicides than glyphosate, so they can spray a different one on there.
Okay, another question is, will they overwinter in hollow stems of plants?
I don't think bumblebees would. Other bees might. Certainly other bees lay their, have nests in hollow stems of plants, like the little leafcutter bees. And they build their little nests in hollow stems of plants. But I think bumblebees would prefer to be down on the ground in a dry place, in a hollow log, a big thing, something like that. There's not a lot known. I know some researchers around now are having people, with all these citizen science programs. There's an effort now in the late fall to go out and look for overwintering queens, to actually muck around in the sort of forest floor to try to find out where these queens are actually going, because there's not that much known, to be honest.
That wouldn't harm them in any way?
Well, no, I mean, I think once you uncover them, you go, oh, that's where they are, and then you can cover them back. I don't know. I've never done it myself. They always have that. They say October 17th is go out and find a queen day, and I'm going, October 17th, there's like 10 inches of snow, so.
We have a whole bunch of thank yous, great talks, great information, Syd, that we can share with our 4.5-year-old granddaughter in Victoria, and she loves bugs and butterflies. Another question: Do workers and drones look different from queens?
Yes. The workers basically look like small queens, so it's hard for me to say what, workers and queens are both females, and basically queens are bigger, So once you know the species, you go, ooh, there's a big one. That's a queen, right? And especially early in the season, you see all these big honking bees flying around, and they're all queens at the beginning. Then in the middle of the summer, most of the bees you'll see are kind of average sized, right? But then some species are bigger than others, so it's hard to say. It's hard to teach someone that what size is a queen, because a queen Nevada bumblebee is like so big people get freaked out when they see one, whereas a queen of, say, a yellow-faced bumblebee is not that big. Anyways, and the drones, the males, they again look different. It's a bit subtle, but we all have this picture of bumblebees as chubby, fuzzy, kind of cute bumblebees. The males tend to be slimmer. They're not, instead of being short and squat, they tend to be longer and more slender. They also have one more segment in their antenna, which isn't a lot, but basically they look longer and skinnier, and they have the same rough pattern that the females do in the abdomen. Like they have the yellow band, the orange band, and the yellow band again, but there tends to be a lot more yellow throughout the whole pattern. So the pattern isn't very, not as striking. It's more frosty yellow looking. So if you see something, and if you see a bunch of these longer, skinnier guys sort of hanging around in a flower and it's September, you can bet they're males. And then you can pick them up and impress your friends, because they won't sting you. So I can read the questions too if you want to, but here it says, how long?
There was someone that.
Or what?
Oh, I was just going to say some were sent to me just privately, so I will read any that you
have. Well, Sharon says, how long do the queens live? They live 1 year. They're born in the late summer of 1 year. They mate that year, and then they spend the winter in hibernation, and then they start their own colony the next spring, and then they will die the following, that summer, at the end of the summer. They don't overwinter a second time. And Marilyn, or do you want me to answer that? Hi, Marilyn. Marilyn's in Coston. Where it went off the top here, just a minute. Oh yeah, so she just says, I'll take more. Great, take more photos. And Trudy says, do bumblebees sting? And the answer, of course, is yes, especially, well, the workers and the queens do sting. And the cuckoo bumblebees try to, when they're taking over a nest, they often sting the other bumblebees to control the nest. But sometimes they have to time it right, because if they try to take over a nest that's already too big, it's already got too many, like more than 30 workers, they will be stung to death themselves. So it's not all happiness and little buzzy bees. So Jacqueline's saying, I'm trying to understand the term Roundup Ready that is marketed to agriculture. Yeah, and so Roundup Ready just means the plants that you're planting are ready to be sprayed with Roundup, and they won't be affected by Roundup. And Roundup is a brand name of glyphosate, yes. So you can spray Roundup on your crop. The crop will be fine, but the weeds will all die. And Jim says he spotted Western bumblebees fairly often. That's great news. Can you talk about the benefits of integrating native plants in our gardens? I personally believe we can support the beta. Yes, I mean, that's obviously, yeah, I think that's really true. The native plants are, I can't say in some cases, but if you have a bunch of native plants that blooming through the summer, they're of course the ones that the native bumblebees have lived with for millennia and are well adapted to. So yes, by all means, plant native plants wherever you can. Don't use much water that way either, and things like, it's all good. So yeah, lots of native, I didn't mention that, but native plants, a lot of flowers through the summer. And Josie says, I imagine disturbing forest devastates wild bumblebees. Clearing. Well, clearing the forest definitely devastates the bumblebees if you're replacing it with pavement and houses and buildings and things like that, because they can't use that at all. In some way, not to suggest that we should bulldoze Gary Oaks ever, I don't think, that's a really an endangered ecosystem. But suburbia is often better for bumblebees than, say, industrial areas or farm. Even intensive farming is worse for bumblebees than suburbia in some of the, because in suburbs we have good people that plant good flowers and so on, and the bees can survive with it. I'm not saying it's ideal at all, but the one thing about bumblebees, and I value forests myself tremendously, but bumblebees don't do well in big, dark, old growth forests. They're bees of the edges. They like the Gary Oak meadows. They like the riparian stream corridors, the meadows, the floodplains, and things like that. So in some senses, like the clear cut, I don't want to advocate clear cuts at all, but the clear cuts for a short time anyways are probably beneficial for bees. But then of course they grow up into these dense second growth forests, and there's no bees at all in those. Do you have any more there, Stephanie, or should I?
Sorry, I just have the ones that you're able to see as well.
Sorry, you have one that?
No, I just the ones that are also visible to you. They were sent
Okay.
to everyone. So if you want to carry on, you can read them, or I'm happy to as well.
Well, Jan asks, re-explain why herbicide-ready crops spell demise for bees. Well, they don't necessarily spell demise, but they might cause a decline because we use a lot of them. And around any agricultural area, if you're using herbicide-ready crops, you're spraying a lot of herbicides, and that means that around the crops, which aren't necessarily good for bees themselves, but the areas around the crops, the road verges, the little paths between the crops, the meadows nearby, all have weedy native plants or non-native plants or whatever, but they have flowering plants that bees use. And so the herbicides that are sprayed on the crops are designed to kill those plants. And so that's why they don't help bees, because the bees go out looking for flowers and they find that the open areas that should have flowers don't have any flowers because they've all been sprayed with herbicides. Right, and Jim says in the Yukon you don't need to put in native plants in the gardens. That's probably true, and a lot of people don't have big gardens here because the gardening season's only a month long. So it says, for identification, do you have a recommendation between iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch? I like the key incorporated in Bumblebee Watch, but I had no feedback for 3 or 4 months and wondered if the site had become inactive. Yeah, so the two, without going into big detail, the two operate on a different scheme. iNaturalist is a crowd, what do you call them? A crowd-based identification. So sometimes the crowd doesn't identify it correctly, so that's a problem, but usually it gets it right shortly, or at least gets it to the area, depending on your photograph. Bumblebee Watch is operated by this small group of bumblebee experts. And sometimes, as you said, I had no feedback for 3 or 4 months here. I've looked at some records on Bumblebee Watch, yes, and they haven't been assessed for 3 or 4 months. So it's not inactive, but I think the people are busy. So that's one of the issues around there. But I've been asked to help out for bees in the north, just to help out on that sort of thing there. But it's a different way of doing things, but they both get, in the end, they both get identified, I hope. And I think that's the last of the questions anyway. So thank you for all the thank yous. Oh, it says, do all bumblebees steal nectar from flowers, or only certain species do this? I didn't mention that, but especially bees, like the Western bumblebee, has relatively short tongues. So they're not very good at getting these long, say a larkspur or something like that, or a columbine, the nectar from that. So some bumblebees have chewed, or they learn to chew on the sides of the flowers to get at the nectar from the side and steal the nectar, in the sense that they get the nectar without pollinating the flower because they don't get into that flower. But of course, many bees want the pollen as well. So, but they need the nectar for energy. So it's mostly the bees with the short tongues that steal the nectar. And I've heard there's some more recent research too that some bees, now I might get this wrong, some bees chew on flowers just to stimulate the plants to produce more flowers, because flowers that are damaged, or plants that have damaged flowers, will produce more flowers in response to that. So the bees keep them going that way. Dana Lipovsky, hi. Hi, Dana. Well, there's another question. Yeah, Evie says, would you recommend the Bumblebee book and where we can purchase it? Well, yeah, I would recommend it. It's the only one. So, yeah, it's a really good book, and it's reasonably priced. And again, they are revising it as we speak. I hope, it gets a little bit better each time. But it's really, it's quite a good book, and I think you can certainly purchase it at any independent bookstore, preferably, but you can also get it off Amazon. Did I say that? Oops. No, I didn't say that. But if it's the Bumblebees of North America, if you just Google just to find its name, Bumblebees of North America, and the first author is Paul Williams. He's a wonderful fellow. He's the bumblebee expert in the, he's the world bumblebee expert. He's not, these are all the people writing that book are big experts.
I feel like there was another question in here. Lots of thank you. Oh, here. You got the one about bumblebees stealing nectar?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they do steal, yeah.
Yeah.
And I know what, Marilyn, I know the Victory Garden for Bees, I don't have that myself, so I can't say I would say all those books on growing bee gardens are probably pretty good, and I don't know specifically that one.
Any other questions? Does anyone want to unmute themselves to ask any questions if you weren't able to write something in the chat? I know I love anything that benefits a messy garden. I love hearing keep your garden messy.
Yeah, get rid of your lawns and just plant stuff. Yeah, preferably not invasive species of things.
Neighbors don't like it much, but I live next door to a person that has fake grass and has everything manicured, and I'm the opposite, so there's constantly a conflict.
Yeah, no, that's a problem too. And yeah, we all love our lawns too much.
I found a bumblebee nest once when we were actually mowing in this big plot next to me, but it was under a whole place of lots of grass and stuff were piled from the year before or something like that, and there was a bumblebee nest in there. Or like
there are
a bunch of broom or something that we'd cut or something like that.
Yeah, they do. If it's in one of those big grassy meadows and there's really thick, tall grass and it falls over and produces kind of a roof, you know, they do nest under that. And there's one species, one of the other, we don't have it in British Columbia, but one of the other endangered species in Canada is called the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus, and it specializes in that kind of nesting habitat. It lives in these old meadows under these big swaths of grass.
Oh, cool. Huh?
Yeah.
Yep. Messy.
Messy grass. Don't mow your lawn.
Is it hard to distinguish a bumblebee nest from other types of bee nests? Or is there anything else that looks similar?
Well,
no, I mean the only other colonial bumblebee, the only other colonial bee we have is the honeybee.
Okay.
And so they're small and kind of browny yellow, you know, they're quite small compared to honeybees. And you know, they go around in great, you know, if they're moving their colony, or if you find a colony that's in a wild place, it's, you know, they're in the thousands, you know, their colonies are massively huge numbers of bees. Whereas bumblebees, like the one I showed you, is just like 20 or 30 or 40 cells of little, you know, of baby bees with big fuzzy bumblebees crawling out of them. So if you see what you believe to be bumblebees flying in and out of a hole in the ground, that's down that hole is a colony. You know, I've found them a couple of times. I haven't really tried, but I haven't ever dug one out to see what it looks like. But although I saw one once checking bluebird boxes in the Chilcote, and I lifted off the lid and got stung by the colony of bumblebees. Mostly because the bluebird box had chickadees in it the year before, and chickadees make that beautiful, beautiful nest out of all sorts of mouse fur and things like that they find. And it's so cozy in there that the bumblebees couldn't resist that one. Okay, well, thanks.
Hey,
nice
thank
to
you
see
very
everybody.
much,
I'm sorry I
Syd.
didn't get to say hi to everyone. Hi, Trudy, and
hi, Syd.
everyone.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks everyone so much for coming.
And Mary, hi, Mary.
And if you guys